In September 2015, global leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In line with ILO social security standards, at the heart of the 2030 Agenda is the pivotal role of social protection, captured under Target 1.3 on universal social protection and Target 3.8 on universal health coverage. We know that close to half of the global population is without any form of social protection benefit. So the question is, how much would it cost to extend the social protection floor to all?
At the ILO, we have calculated the annual financing gap for universal social protection floors in low and middle income countries. In 2024, the financing gap corresponds to $1.4 trillion. This amounts to an additional 3.3% of GDP that needs to be invested in social protection to ensure universal coverage. Of this 3.3% of GDP, 1.3% of GDP is needed to ensure universal social protection coverage for children, disability, maternity, old age, and unemployment benefits. And 2% of GDP is needed for ensuring universal coverage for essential health care.
As you can see, the global averages conceal significant disparities between national income groups and regions. Low-income countries face the largest financing gap as a proportion of their GDP, due to large social protection coverage gaps and low GDP of these countries. African countries in particular face the most significant challenges. The financing gap for them is 17.6% of the entire continent's GDP. Low and middle income countries in the Arab states have the second biggest financing gap, 11.4% of that region's GDP. While in Latin America and the Caribbean, the financing gap for universal social protection is down to 2.7% of GDP, followed by Asia and the Pacific with 2.0% of GDP, and Europe and Central Asia with 1.9% of GDP.
The ILO's financing gap estimates also include estimations of the financing gap relative to general government expenditure and also relative to social protection expenditure. Both these figures are very helpful for assessing countries' capacities to close the financing gap. There are three numbers that we should recall from the financing gap estimates. To achieve a universal social protection floor, countries have to invest an additional 3.3% of GDP, which is equivalent to an additional 11% of general government expenditure or 32% of public social protection expenditure. Country-level statistics are available on the ILO website and on the ILO social protection platform.
There are a range of options for low and middle-income countries to actively expand their fiscal space for social protection with a view to closing the financing gap. It is internationally agreed that the main fiscal space option to close the financing gap is domestic resource mobilization, which means strengthening progressive taxation and social security contributions. Considerable fiscal space could also be generated by progressively phasing out fossil fuel subsidies in middle-income countries. This is also imperative for climate action and a just transition to an economy that is within planetary boundaries. For example, across lower middle-income countries, fossil fuel subsidies represent 10.5% of GDP, and they compare with a financing gap of 6.9% of GDP.
But as you can see in the chart, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies will not be sufficient to close the financing gap in low-income countries. In these countries, the annual financing gap represents more than half of the country's GDP, which makes international solidarity absolutely necessary. However, the current official development assistance is not sufficient, and only a small proportion of it goes to social protection. The global community needs to do more to create an enabling global financial architecture that supports countries' efforts in mobilizing resources domestically, through better global coordination on tax matters and efforts to reduce illicit financial flows.
It is important to stress that the financing gap estimate provides a broad global overview and cannot replace the fine-grained country-level costing and fiscal planning exercises. So, what are the figures telling us? They're telling us that we urgently need coordinated national action backed by conducive global coordination in order to build social protection systems and floors which are critical for delivering on the promises of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.